Many scholars and directors have attested to the capacity of the horror film to expose the darkest recesses of both society and the human experience overall. Perhaps one of the most seminal critics in the field of horror studies is Robin Wood, who described horror films as the return of the repressed, representing the suppressed anxieties that leak and bleed out of the subterfuge of normal status quo society. According to Wood, if popular films represent the collective dreams of both creators and audiences that share a similar worldview, then it becomes easy to offer a simple definition of horror films. They are our collective nightmare. In John Tallison's 2014 book, Subversive Horror Cinema, he argues that horror as a genre is uniquely suited to tackle subversive topics since it is largely concerned with shocking its audiences in the first place. Because horror inherently, quote, operates outside the bounds of society, it is able to address contemporary social issues in ways that would seem inappropriate or even offensive to other genres. The book outlines how every horror film is inherently reactive, meaning they respond and explore human or cultural anxieties to generate an intense response, like how the human fear of heights and extreme speed makes riding a roller coaster an exhilarating experience. Horror films can respond to common human fears, like death, monsters, or just whatever's lurking in the darkness while we sleep. But they are also often reactive to social anxieties, with monsters serving as stand-ins for contemporary social problems. For example, look at the popularity of alien invasion movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers during the Cold War, in which Americans were anxious about communist invaders, or giant monster movies such as Godzilla in reaction to the terror of the atom bomb, or more recent films about mistrust of our neighbors and social instability and in time of intense political division. However, while every horror movie could be considered reactive, they outline 4 specific traits that can make a horror film subversive, meaning they not only respond to our social anxieties, but they ask us why we have these anxieties in the first place. And instead of depicting the status quo as something to be desired and returned to, they depict the horror lurking in the darkness underneath the veneer of everyday society. These 4 traits of subversive horror include the following. They are anti-authority, they are sympathetic to monstrosity, they have an unwillingness to reaffirm normative values, and finally, they attack the audience not only through confrontations with the grotesque or threatening, but through ideological shock, meaning they threaten our ideas of right and wrong, normal and abnormal, just and unjust, to not only make the audience feel emotionally or physically unsettled, but to shake up our entire worldview. So, what are the forces that authority figures seek to make monstrous? And what are the normative values that need to be ideologically shaken? According to Robin Wood, social stability and order often rely on propping up and privileging certain people and their ideologies while repressing the forces that may challenge them. Wood states that what escapes repression has to be dealt with by oppression. And he goes on to list 8 forces that may challenge or cause anxiety to the normative status quo, at least in contemporary Western society, and are likewise often repressed. These include other people, followed by women, the proletariat, otherwise known as the working class, other cultures, ethnic groups within the culture, alternative ideologies or political systems, deviations from the ideological sexual norms such as LGBTQ+ people, and finally, children, whose behavior is a source of anxiety since they mentally have not yet come to understand the values and expectations of society. In this video, I'll be discussing several classic horror films that subvert a society that represses many of these forces, but I'll be wrapping them up together in terms of representation of economic class, race, and gender. Most of these classic films will be from the 1960s and 70s, a period of massive social and political shifts in American culture triggered by the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, and the war in Vietnam, all which contributed to an overall fresh sense of doubt and suspicion against the American status quo. Additionally, this video will be comparing each of these classic films to horror movies released in the past decade. With the rise of political movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Me Too, and Black Lives Matter, all of which have occurred throughout the historical election of the first black president and into the subsequent conservative reaction, recent horror films have a subversive energy and tone comparable to that of the late 1960s and 1970s. So join me in this exploration into the world of subversive horror films in times of social change. But first, I want to give a major spoiler warning for the following films: the original Texas Chain Saw Massacre, Night of the Living Dead, and the Stepford Wives, as well as the modern movies The Platform, Get Out, and X. With that out of the way, let's get started. Tobe Hooper's 1974 horror masterpiece, the original Texas Chain Saw Massacre, tells the tale of 5 teenagers on a road trip through the rural heartland of Texas. When we first meet them, the teenagers listen to the radio broadcast about violent murders in the area, while one reads an astrology book attempting to make sense of all the chaos and hostility in the world surrounding them.
There are moments when we cannot believe that what is happening is really true. Pinch yourself and you may find out that it is.
They encounter this hostility face to face when they pick up a hitchhiker who was part of a family of slaughterhouse workers before the widespread implementation of the air gun used to kill cattle more efficiently. However, the hitchhiker laments this move from the old way of simply clobbering cows with a hammer.
Well, how come? I thought the gun was better.
Oh, no. With the new way people put out of jobs.
The hitchhiker's family's way of life has become defunct in the face of the industrialization of the meat industry, leaving him, its youngest member, nothing but a lunatic that goes on to cut his hand and smear his own blood on the side of the white van, marking the teenagers as they cross the threshold between their carefree lifestyle and journey into a realm of violence and bloodshed. The teens stop at a rundown gas station only to be told that they're out of gas, mirroring the real-life 1973 oil crisis in which many Arab countries proclaimed an embargo against nations like the United States that were supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, a situation in which the industrialized war machine resulted in economic hardships for regular people. To support another stream of revenue, the gas station worker offers the kids some barbecue while they wait for gas to arrive, and the kids take up his offer before waiting it out in an abandoned family home. Some of the kids venture out to a nearby house before eventually meeting Leatherface, a gargantuan, intellectually disabled man that only speaks in grunts and dons a skinned human face to hide his own. Eventually, all of the teens except Sally are killed like animals by Leatherface. Sally escapes Leatherface only to be later tied up at the family dinner table, where she encounters the hitchhiker, the gas station attendant, Leatherface, and their grandfather, when she realizes that she is both the guest of honor as well as the main course of the meal, which also suggests the true, cannibalistic nature of the family's barbecue business. Sally escapes when the family attempts to get the grandfather to kill her with a hammer, and the film ends with Sally hopping in the bed of a passerby's pickup truck, sobbing and laughing hysterically, while Leatherface seems to dance in the sunrise after he fails to seize his final victim. Texas Chain Saw is a reactive horror film that is exploring the anxieties of isolated rural living. However, as a subversive horror film, it is anti-authority through its rejection of the typical American family, whereby a working-class family in America's heartland is portrayed as anything but innocent, all while still clinging to notions of pride for the home.
Look what your brother did to that door! He got no pride in his home!
Work, communion, and patriarchal order. The film is sympathetic to monstrosity through its depiction of the family's plight as redundant former slaughterhouse workers unable to thrive within the changing industrialized world. Leatherface in particular, despite being the most violent character, is portrayed as being confused and desperate to maintain normality in the home. He attempts to kill the invaders of his house, and he hooks, cuts, and freezes them like meat to support the family's barbecue business, representing the cannibalistic potential of capitalism whereby moral transgressions can be justified in the name of supporting a way of life. He even puts feminine makeup on his mask to fill the role of the missing mother figure in the home. This twisted caricature subverts normative values by portraying their desperation to attain some semblance of an outdated past, such as when the decrepit and impotent grandfather is forced to attempt to kill Sally at dinner with a hammer like he did the cows before the invention of the air gun.
You always said he's the best! He's the best, all right.
Finally, the Texas Chain Saw Massacre is ideologically shocking through its depiction of a family that desperately clings to normality, all in service of the same ideological system of patriarchal capitalism whose greater mechanisms have now left them behind as tragically redundant. While the rest of the films in this video will be American, the 2019 Spanish film, The Platform, directed by Galder Gaztelu Urrutia, serves as an excellent example of modern horror cinema's more overt approaches to class commentary. The film is about a man named Goring, who has been admitted to an enormous tower containing hundreds of concrete cells connected by a single square hole. Every day, a single large platform containing a massive amount of food descends from the very top cell to the very bottom, with each cell being given just several minutes to eat from it. Theoretically, the platform contains enough food for every person in the facility. In execution, however, the people in the top cells consume as much as they can, leaving only scraps and eventually empty plates for the lower cells.
That means if there are 47 levels above us and 2 people per level, we're eating leftovers from 94 others.
Don't worry, as the month goes by, there will be less of those above. You're not eating?
No appetite.
As a single consolation for the deplorable situation, prisoners are only allowed to bring in a single object, and while Goring elects to take in a single copy of Don Quixote, most other prisoners, including his cellmate Trimagasi, bring weapons. While Goring reveals that he voluntarily admitted himself to the facility to earn a college degree, Trimagasi reveals that he was forced here as punishment for a crime, and he expresses contempt that Goring will be able to receive a degree for suffering the same as him. Goring is initially repulsed by the whole situation, realizing that eating too much won't leave enough for those below. That is, until hunger gets the best of him. After waking up deep down in level 171, Trimagasi ties up and attempts to cannibalize Goring alive, before he is saved by a mysterious woman. And in his rage, Goring murders Trimagasi and is eventually forced to eat him to survive, reflecting the desperation of those in the lower dregs of society that can force a person to abandon their own humanity. Goring is reassigned to level 33 with a woman named Imaguri, who had been a former administration official of the facility, even being the one to interview Goring himself. Thinking that the tower only contains 200 levels and just enough food for everybody to survive,
if everybody ate only what they needed, the food would get to the lowest level.
she attempts to create solidarity with the lower levels by convincing them to ration their food, only to be rejected until Goring threatens to defecate on the platform if they don't comply. When Imaguri discusses attempting to achieve solidarity with the cell above, Goring simply responds,
Because I can't shit upwards, you see?
Eventually, the two are reassigned to level 200, where Imaguri hangs herself, forcing Goring to once again resort to cannibalism to survive. He's then reassigned all the way up to level 6 with a man named Barat. Having both experienced the suffering at the lowest levels, they decide to help the people below by arming themselves and descending on the platform so that they can forcibly ration the food to only those that need it and hurt anybody that resists.
We're asking for 1 day of fasting.
A day of fasting?
Yes.
And who made you king of shit?
This endeavor to basically steal from the rich and give to the poor represents the culmination of Goring deciding that he can only attain class solidarity through threats and violence, drawing a parallel between the forceful and violent methods of achieving total supposed equality in communist revolutions such as the former Russian Revolution under Joseph Stalin or the Chinese Revolution under Mao Zedong. Descending further down, the duo encounters dozens of scenes of murder and cannibalism by those left into the deepest chasms of the facility. The two descend to the final level, level 333, where they encounter a lone child who they decide to feed the last remaining dish. They decide that the child will serve as a symbolic message to the administration of their triumph against greed and hunger.
She's the message.
And after Barat dies from blood loss from a wound, Goring and the child descend into a seemingly infinite void. And the film ends ambiguously, with Goring alone with the apparition of Trimagasi as the child ascends rapidly to the top. The facility in the platform is a fairly obvious allegory that is reactive to intense global class stratification, and it is subversively anti-authority through its depiction of those at the top, representing the rich as indifferent and even calloused against those below them. It is also sympathetic to monstrosity through its depiction of the dehumanization that happens to even its protagonist, who despite meaning well, must also engage in cannibalism just to survive, emphasizing how the conditions of the system of intense class stratification can rob people at the bottom of their humanity, who are more likely to resort to crime and antisocial acts in the face of the desperation and trauma that comes with extreme poverty. While it's easy to see the film's critique of the normative values of capitalism, I would also argue that it even critiques the ideals of socialism, since everybody on the platform still lives in the same living conditions while also being randomly displaced to other cells, which should ideally make it easy for them to form solidarity with one another due to their common lived experiences. Yet, they still exploit any sliver of privilege and turn against one another so that they can eat more than those below.
The ones below are below, Goring.
But next month, they might be above.
Yes, and they will piss on us. Those pricks.
This film doesn't settle for a simple interpretation that implicates any specific economic system.
You are one of those who think the administration does everything wrong.
Instead, it portrays its main antagonist as a simple human need for physiological sustenance, which is able to trump our ability to cooperate.
We come from level 88, we're barely alive!
In the director's own words, the food was treated as another character in the story, one that is aesthetically antagonistic to the architecture of the prison. This ambiguity ultimately leads to the film's ideological shock, which comes hand in hand with the film's physical horror. The food on the titular platform reduces the prisoners to mere animals that think that they can only solve their problems through violence or symbolic messages, solutions which still aren't even affirmed by its ambiguous ending. Ultimately, both the Texas Chain Saw Massacre and The Platform depict desperate portraits of humanity's attempt to retain control in the face of the indifference and hunger that forces their characters to literally consume one another just to survive. While both films critique class disenfranchisement, neither is willing to provide an idealistic solution to the problem, instead leaving the audience to contemplate the bleak reality of our condition as flesh and blood animals that will always feel compelled to destroy one another. One of the most influential horror films of all time, George A. Romero's 1968 classic, Night of the Living Dead, could be considered a reactive horror movie to the chaos and uncertainty that came with the late 1960s, with the news coverage of the zombie outbreak mirroring that of the turmoil of the news coverage from that time period. However, for this segment, we will focus on director George Romero's decision to cast Duane Jones, an African-American actor, in its lead role at a time of immense racial turmoil. Romero remarked in an interview that Duane Jones was the best actor he met to play the character Ben.
I mean, Duane Jones was the best actor from among our friends. And Duane just agreed to play the role. And so we thought, well, we'll be very hip and we won't change the script.
Meaning that his casting choice was purely based on his talent and was not meant to reflect any racialized themes in the script. However, the film had only been half written before shooting, and many changes were made to Ben's character before and during filming, much due to the influence of Duane Jones himself due to his awareness of how his race might be perceived in the film. Duane once remarked, "It never occurred to me that I was hired because I was black, but it did occur to me that it would give a different historic element to the film," with Romero even admitting that because the character is played by an African American, you almost don't notice anything else. It's important to understand the context of black representation in Hollywood around this time period, just 4 years after the Civil Rights Act. While black male leads were not unheard of at the time, such as is the case with actor Sidney Poitier, their depictions were often catered to white middle-class sensibilities. This isn't to say that these films were necessarily bad, and they were certainly very progressive for their time period, such as 1967's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, one of the first films to offer a positive depiction of interracial marriage, in that same year that the Supreme Court declared laws against them as unconstitutional. However, some of their depictions of black characters were largely meant to appease white middle-class sensibilities that were out of touch with the continued struggle of people of color.
Do you mean have we been to bed together? I don't mind your asking me that. We haven't. He wouldn't.
However, Night of the Living Dead is notable for this time period since it did not whitewash its African American lead actor, offering a great deal of racial subtext, even if initially by accident. The film begins with Barbara and her brother Johnny driving to a cemetery to visit their father's grave, before Johnny is killed by a deranged psychopath, forcing Barbara to flee to a nearby seemingly empty home. This is when she meets Ben, her shocked facial expression given new meaning when considering the racial climate surrounding the film's production. This racial tension is further amplified when Ben, seeing Barbara's erratic behavior, slaps her in the face before loosening her jacket as a blanket while she recovers. In this situation, the constructed racial hierarchies of the outside world are made redundant, as Ben has no time to take into account Barbara's privileged status as a white woman in a situation where level-headedness and resourcefulness are what matter most. This dynamic is further emphasized when they discover that several others have been hiding out in the basement, further complicating the power dynamic. Harry, the oldest of the bunch, asserts himself as the new leader, challenging Ben's authority. This tension comes to a head after the gang concoct a plan to reach a gas tank to fuel a truck. The plan backfires when the gas spills onto a torch, engulfing the younger Tom and his girlfriend in flames. Ben retreats back to the house, only for Harry to cowardly hesitate and refuse to open the door, prompting Ben to knock his lights out. By this point, Harry represents nothing more than the sum of his privileged parts. He is white, a husband, and a father, all traits favored especially in contemporary American society. Yet it is clear that Ben is the more competent and courageous member of the group, traits which favor him as the leader against the imminent threat outside. This tension comes to its climax as the zombies break into the house. Harry tries to shoot Ben only to be disarmed and shot back before dying in the cellar next to his now dead daughter, who eventually becomes a zombie and kills her own mother before Ben retreats to the cellar, being forced to shoot the whole zombified family to wait out the attack until morning. In the original ending of the film, Romero wrote Ben as a triumphant hero that would emerge from the house in the morning to be rescued by a band of deputized militants. However, Duane Jones himself convinced Romero that it would be unrealistic for his character to survive, telling him that, quote, "the black community would rather see me dead than saved." Believing the original ending would have been disingenuous to the reality of African Americans and the police, so instead, the film ends with Ben being mistaken for a zombie and shot dead. As far as being a subversive horror film, this ending is very anti-authority, since the militarized saviors of society are actually depicted as being careless, unceremoniously killing the protagonist in spite of all that he had been through.
Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
The film is more sympathetic to the marginalized than monstrosity, depicting Duane Jones' character as able to tackle these new, unique, and terrifying challenges both inside and outside the house. The film is unwilling to reaffirm normative values, since family bonds are depicted as liabilities rather than privileges, such as when honoring a dead family member results in the death of Johnny, traumatizing Barbara throughout the rest of the film before he returns as a zombie to kill her, as well as Tom's girlfriend insisting on joining his mission only to die with him, or when the zombified daughter murders her own mother. Instead, the film focuses on the value of a non-traditional family of people connected through shared circumstances. In the end, it is only Ben, the one that was not clouded by these connections, that is able to survive, only to be murdered by a militarized force bent on returning things back to the way they were. All these things contribute to the film's ideological shock, whereby all of the things most valued in society, like family, tradition, and a clear dividing line between the living and the dead, are rendered valueless in the face of existential and shared threats. While some might not be totally convinced of the racial subtext of 1968's Night of the Living Dead, there is no ignoring the vastly more overt messaging of Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out, and its commentary about the ways in which white supremacy finds ways to morph and contort itself into a seemingly post-racial society. The film follows Chris Washington and his white girlfriend Rose, as the couple are preparing for a trip to meet Rose's parents, somewhat reflecting the plot of Sidney Poitier's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. While this meeting makes Chris anxious about how her family will react to his race, Rose insists that her family is not racist, which they confirm when meeting him to an almost comical extreme.
By the way, I would have voted for Obama for a third term if I could. Best president in my lifetime, hands down.
I agree.
However, Chris eventually becomes suspicious when he notices that the family's hired help are exclusively black and noticeably awkward. Rose's father, Dean, acknowledges the optics of their living situation resembling a slavery plantation before offering a seemingly unproblematic explanation. Already, the film is reactive to anxieties and paranoia experienced by many African Americans when placed in majority white spaces, and this is further elevated when Rose and Chris discover that the family is planning on hosting an annual get-together of friends and relatives. While the guests portray a seemingly well-meaning attitude towards race,
black is in fashion.
They are oblivious to how they're also singling out Chris, which is ultimately counterintuitive to their supposed anti-racist views when they are actively making his race the focal point of every conversation and emphasizing his minority status among them. However, unbeknownst to Chris, the get-together is actually an elaborate auction to purchase him like a slave, an unsettling reality that Chris becomes more privy to after he discovers a photo album of Rose standing with past partners that were all black, despite her initially claiming that she had never had a black boyfriend. This revelation makes previous scenes in the film take on a new meaning, such as when Rose stuck up for Chris to a police officer, only faking genuine support of Chris so she could continue luring him to her family, mirroring the virtue signaling of supposed allies against racial prejudice who are more absorbed in promoting their supposed moral superiority than actually helping those affected by injustice. After realizing the extremes of the situation, Chris attempts to escape before he is hypnotized and wakes up to learn that he is to be the victim of the coagula technique, whereby the consciousness of white buyers can assume the body of black people, erasing the host's consciousness almost entirely, which reveals the strange behavior of all the black characters beforehand whose consciousnesses were locked behind their white hosts, literalizing an extreme of W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness.
I want your eye, man. I want those things you see through.
This allegorically represents all the ways in which white society has benefited from black bodies or appropriated culture while simultaneously repressing and ignoring the experience of black people themselves. Chris soon escapes his binds, fending off the attacking family members before a climactic showdown with Rose, who pursues him to the bitter end. With the ordeal almost over, police lights flash, the siren blaring as it arrives at the sight of Chris on top of Rose. I remember my heart stopping during this scene with knowledge of police killings of unarmed black men such as Eric Garner and Michael Brown, among literally hundreds of others, leading me and I think the rest of the audience to assume the worst about this film's conclusion. That is, until it's revealed to actually be Chris's best friend Rod, an airport TSA officer who was set off to rescue Chris after becoming suspicious of the situation. The two drive off, leaving Rose behind, leaving Chris's ultimate fate ambiguously unknown. Get Out is obviously anti-authority and sympathetic to the marginalized since it literalizes white supremacy and black exploitation while portraying literally all of its white characters as complicit in robbing black people of their freedom. It's very in conversation with other anti-racist films, which typically depict at least a single heroic white character that sticks up for the black character or even just rescues them entirely.
If it brings you your freedom, it will be more than a pleasure. It will have been my duty.
However, Get Out never delivers upon this trope. It also doubles as an attack on normative values since it depicts the white liberal characters that claim to be anti-racist as ultimately complicit in new, unique forms of black exploitation, showing that, ultimately, they value self-preservation over the values they claim. This presents an ideological shock, which could contribute to a cynical interpretation that the film is simply anti-white since it depicts its white characters in an entirely negative light. But I would argue instead that this anxiety that white audiences might feel can be used to look inward and re-examine the motivations and implicit biases that even progressive liberals, like myself, are not immune to. Interestingly enough, the original script of Get Out actually ends with Chris getting caught by real police, concluding with Rod talking to him only through the bars of a jail cell. It turns out that this ending was changed only after receiving negative reception from test audiences. In researching this film side by side with Night of the Living Dead, I found this to be an interesting contrast to the original intended ending of that film, which was going to conclude on a much more positive note before being changed to a more tragic yet realistic one. While I realize that these are entirely incidental circumstances, I don't think it's entirely naive to call this distinction between two horror films with some similar racial subtext divided by half a century to be, perhaps, somewhat optimistic of the future and reflective of how far we have come, even if there's still much more to be done. While Get Out is certainly an incredibly original film through both its message and premise, it is not without its influences, one of the major ones being Brian Forbes' 1975 film The Stepford Wives, based on the novel by Ira Levin. Similar to Get Out, a couple moves from the big city to a rural community where the main character, Joanna, becomes suspicious of the overly submissive wives of the members of the Men's Association, ran by President Dale Koba, nicknamed Diz after his previous job working at Disneyland.
I like to watch women doing little domestic chores. You came to the right town.
After befriending another newcomer named Bobby, the two set out to create their own women's club in order to empower the overly submissive Stepford Wives through discussion about feminism and their experiences as other women, but they are largely unreceptive. Despite bonding over their frustrations with the archaic lifestyle of Stepford, Joanna is shocked to see her feminist ally and friend turn into an automaton, inhuman housewife.
What does archaic mean?
Archaic?
Yes.
I don't know.
That barely reacts even when being stabbed.
Joanna. How could you do a thing like that?
Chances are you are already familiar with the plot of this film or its 2004 remake. You can already guess its conclusion, in which it is revealed that the Stepford Wives are in fact all victims of a scheme to turn them into overly subservient housewives. It's one of those classic tales that just kind of become part of the cultural zeitgeist, with the term Stepford Wives being used as a pejorative for those types of housewives, especially today in the face of the rad trad or radical traditionalist movement. However, what I find interesting about the original Stepford Wives is how it also implicates consumerism within its fictional expose of a society unfairly dominated by men, otherwise known as patriarchy. In the scene where the women first meet up in their club, Joanna attempts to begin the discussion by inviting the members to discuss their experiences as women, but the conversation quickly devolves into a discussion about various cleaning and cooking products, resembling more of a conversation between advertisements rather than dynamic human beings with real motivations and feelings.
I'm not trying to be a leader or anything, but we're not supposed to delve quite so specifically into housework.
Isiah's really that good, is it? Is it that good? Well, if time is your enemy, make friends with Isiah, that's all I can tell you.
This is further developed in the ending of the film after Joanna has been killed by her own Stepford wife doppelganger, in which she is seen walking the aisles of a supermarket, blithely greeting the other wives as they all choose between the various products. These images seem to conflate the women's exploitation as commodified objects themselves, mere husks through which to further propagate a fantasy of a consumerist utopia that robs women of autonomy, all in favor of both serving their husbands and households. This connection between patriarchy, consumerism, and fantasy are even more highlighted when considering the nickname of the Men's Association president, Diz, who once worked at a place devoted entirely to the consumption of a fantasy that can only exist when being bolstered by the revenue of customers willing to shell out their hard-earned money, all so they can experience a temporary release from the anxieties and realities of the world around them. However, unlike the employees at Disney, the Stepford Wives cannot take off the costumes given to them by a patriarchal cartoonish fantasy in which women are totally content and fulfilled by their roles as subservient to the whims of their husbands. Given its time period of production, The Stepford Wives is a very reactive film to the tension between the ideals of second-wave feminism, ushered in by the women's movement of the 1960s, versus a long-standing conservative ideology that preferred women to be quote-unquote in their place. It is anti-authority through its depiction of the patriarchal Men's Association as being villainous, cold, and willing to rob women of total body and mental autonomy. However, there is a small touch of sympathy towards the monstrosity as well, since the men often express their stress over their demanding, presumably high-paying jobs that keep them alienated from their wives and children. The film has an unwillingness to reaffirm normative values since it is a direct criticism of the archaic role of the subservient housewife, with this lifestyle depicted as unnatural since the Stepford Wives are all essentially inorganic robots.
I'll just die if I don't get this recipe. I'll just die if I don't get this recipe. I'll just die if I don't get this recipe.
And finally, the real ideological shock of the film comes through the portrayal of the men as being fairly normal. The husband, much like Rose from Get Out, initially comes across as a fairly nice guy. But as the film continues, we realize how even a halfway decent man can still exploit his privileged position in a patriarchal society, even if it means totally destroying the humanity of the people they're supposed to love the most, their spouses.
I've already gotten over it. That's not what I'm talking about.
Do you understand that I really love you?
When looking for a modern horror film that touches upon feminist themes in an incredibly subversive way, you might not need to look further than T. West and Mia Goth's X, released in 2022. The film is interesting in that it is not only in conversation with American culture as a whole, but many classic horror movies and tropes themselves, with it even being set in the time period of many of the films discussed in this video, the 1970s, specifically back in the rural heartland of Texas. X follows a band of sex workers, including Maxine and her fiancé Wayne, fellow actors Bobby Lynn and Jackson, as well as an aspiring filmmaker named RJ and his girlfriend named Lorraine, as they set off to shoot a pornography film in the house of the backyard of an elderly man named Howard and his especially creepy wife, Pearl. Radical Christian televangelist broadcasts in the area suggest the couple's conservative Christian leanings and their fear of the corrupted New Age youth, but little do they know of the intentions of Wayne's gang until Pearl later spies on the gang while Maxine and Jackson are shooting a scene, with Pearl being visibly aroused by the sight. After shooting the scene, RJ's girlfriend Lorraine asks how Maxine can have sex with another man on camera with her fiancé right there. And though she is initially unsettled by the reaction, she eventually asks if she can perform in a scene as well. RJ promptly steps in and refuses on her behalf. And when Wayne discusses the matter with him outside, RJ states that his girlfriend is not like the other girls. RJ, though he feels that he is artistically elevating the genre through his filmmaking, he fails to see his hypocrisy, mirroring that of other male directors that viewed themselves as artistic visionaries even when they were willing to exploit their subjects. Eventually, RJ agrees to the scene and even shoots it himself. But after this traumatizing experience, he attempts to abandon the gang before seeing Pearl, who attempts to seduce him before murdering him when he rejects her, which really contributes to our understanding of her as an incredibly sexually frustrated woman. And this is where the film really begins to get into conversation with other slasher tropes. In her seminal text on horror studies, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, scholar Carol Clover argues that slasher villains often represent male sexual repression and frustration, their knives acting as a phallic release of their pent-up aggression on sexually active kids, which ironically often parallels the generally sexually inactive final girl. X uniquely explores this dynamic from an elderly woman's perspective, with her sexuality repressed equally alongside her repressed psychopathy. Just as in the slashers the film pays homage to, Pearl and Howard go on to murder the entirety of the gang, always chastising them for their sexual deviance even when the characters are offering to help them. And speaking of the final girl, a term first coined by Carol Clover in that same book, let's take a brief sidestep to talk about the trope itself before discussing how it is subverted in X. And there's perhaps no better example of a quintessential final girl than in John Carpenter's 1978 classic, Halloween. Laurie, the film's final girl, is reserved, shy, and more focused on her responsibilities in school and her job as a babysitter, while her female friends are all mostly interested in partying and hooking up with their boyfriends. When the deranged killer Michael Myers escapes prison and pursues Laurie and her friends are distracted by their sexual endeavors, both being killed by Michael either just before having sex or just afterwards. On the other hand, Laurie is able to survive through her wits and resourcefulness. In the end, Laurie manages to stab Michael several times before ultimately being saved by Michael's male psychiatrist, Dr. Loomis.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
While the final girl trope could be considered a somewhat positive representation of women since it encourages male audience members to sympathize with strong, independent female characters, it has also been criticized for how it narratively punishes other women for their promiscuity while simultaneously sexualizing them through fan service.
We love premarital sex.
That is, with the very notable exception of Maxine in X. While she is able to escape the killers through her intelligence and competence like the traditional final girl, she is anything but shy and sexually inactive. She's a literal stripper and aspiring porn star. Despite this, the narrative does not punish her, even if other characters attempt to. Even when Maxine rescues Lorraine from a cellar, Lorraine blames Maxine and the others for everything that has happened, before being promptly shot by Howard, who dies of a heart attack shortly after. The climax sees Maxine holding up Pearl to give her the keys to the truck, all while the televangelist preaches retribution against sinners in the background. In the showdown between Maxine and Pearl, Pearl has the gall to compare her sins of murder to Maxine's sexual deviancy, offering a clear parallel to religious fundamentalists that equate unconventional attitudes towards sex to crimes that are incomparably more antisocial and dangerous. When Maxine discovers the gun to be unloaded and dodges a shot from Pearl, unlike in Halloween, nobody else has to show up to save the day. Pearl, engulfed in cognitive dissonance until the bitter end, meets her demise when Maxine runs her over with the truck, ending a lifetime of combined psychopathic and sexual repression that imprisoned Pearl in her own head. The plot ends, revealing that the pastor on TV was none other than Maxine's own father, explaining that Maxine's own attitude towards sex was likely shaped by her own repression. X operates as a reactive horror film to changing attitudes towards sex in our society. It is anti-authority through its depiction of the old conservative puritanical values embodied by the film's villains. However, the film is not only sympathetic to the marginalized sex workers, but even its villains as well. After all, life has passed them by as they've sat in the isolated rural countryside, while their religious beliefs have fueled their righteous indignation against an outside world that has gone on and changed without them. Pearl, in particular, while outwardly judgmental of the gang of sex workers, secretly pines for their youth and energy, which she is not only incapable of because of her old age, but because she is from a time and place in which she could have never expressed herself like them in the first place. This feeds into the film's unwillingness to reaffirm normative values, since the values of sexual chastity are the main target of the film's narrative, depicting sexual repression as dangerous and volatile. Finally, the ideological shock is expressed through its attack on puritanical prudishness. Every character that thinks they are above the aspiring porn stars are depicted as hypocrites, whether they're Howard and Pearl believing their murder spree is justified, RJ wanting to simultaneously benefit from sex work while believing he is above it, or finally Lorraine, who blames Maxine for everything when the obvious villains are nobody except the old, resentful, religiously conservative couple. Despite the many ways that X subverts the tropes of classic slasher flicks, I wouldn't say that it is necessarily condemning them or even criticizing them. After all, the source of X's villains, much like the classic slasher killers, is repression, an anger against everything they are afraid of or intimidates them. The Stepford Wives 2 is a film about repression of what is natural. The women are stripped of all autonomy and freedom and transformed into mere robots that serve nothing but to bolster an imaginary reality. X and the Stepford Wives both confront the horrors of an experience particularly relevant to women, in which patriarchal standards of femininity are at odds with reality, resulting in women's minds and bodies being so scrutinized and objectified that some women collapse under the pressure of a society trying to force them into an idealized fantasy, almost entirely constructed by the desires and anxieties of men. When analyzing the subversive and politically charged messaging of horror films, whether they're buried underneath layers of subtext or made impossible to ignore, it could be a fair critique to mention how these films often point out problems in society while not actually providing a solution. While many mainstream films propose idealized solutions to defeat their morally corrupt villains, such as appealing to the power of friendship overcoming the forces of evil, horror films don't typically leave the audience feeling as if the problem has actually been resolved. If there are any survivors, we can only be left to contemplate how they will cope with the traumas they endured. And as the audience, we're left to deal with often uncomfortably ambiguous or tragic resolutions. Instead, subversive horror films refuse to do the thinking for us, challenging us to recontextualize our ideological and moral assumptions, and draw our own conclusions based on what we just endured. Subversive horror forces us to confront what has been veiled behind the shadows, but it also provides us an opportunity to shine a light into the dark recesses we pretend do not exist, even when they continue to affect our lives. Whether it's our animalistic nature hiding behind the constructs of family life and class, the continued oppression of the marginalized in a supposedly post-racial society, or our personal agency and desires being masked behind a repressive fantasy, horror movies don't show us what we want to look at and experience, they show us what we need to see and feel. They may tear, maim, and slice our worldview into pieces, but it's up to us to decide if we can put them back together to form a newer, better way of viewing and interacting with the world.